Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to continue in a sermon conversation called Grooves, where we're going to try to tackle through a drawing. Is there a way to anticipate the different grooves that the soul takes from beginning to end in life's journey with God? And if there's any chance that these two drawings and the stories that they convey can give us that hope, then they need to encounter some of the most profound experiences that we have as human beings. And as we talk about the second thirds of life today and try to get to the bottom of what one could expect between their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, there's a couple things that happen in that chunk of life that this model and the scriptures and God himself need to provide for us to be an aid for the days to come. And so we started our conversation last week. We've got a couple of drawings. We're trying to make some sort of sense out of all of it with dashes and with solid lines and with circles. And so last week we talked about the first third of life, the birth through 20 or to the mid-20s. We talked about the heroic journey for the masculine soul, the climbing and the conquering and the power drivenness that happens in that first third of life. And we talked about the descent in the female journey, how these two souls are going in two opposite directions in the first third of life. And so as we zoom into the second third of our experience, we begin to fill in a bit more of that drawing. And it's a little bit hard to see from where you're at, particularly as church people who sit as far away as possible if you're the first ones in the room. And the front's open to those who get here last. We'll try to make a sense of all these drawings bit by bit as we go through. But let me start with just a story and an interesting plea from a anxious parent. I want to introduce you to Ashton Blocker. She is this is her family picture, and she's the one with glasses on her brother's shoulders here, kind of the piggyback right there. She has an interesting disease, and she's had it since she was born, an insensitivity to pain. With anhidrosis, and her parents had no idea what was going on early in life, but when they took her into those first shots and she didn't let out a cry or a wail of pain, they thought they maybe hit the jackpot, that their kid was just a really tough kid. But as she continued to grow up, she had all these different mishaps that happened in her early days where she wasn't able to feel pain during a painful moment. So for instance, she was cut by a piece of glass and she didn't feel it, or she put her hand in a boiling pot of water and she didn't pull it away like everyone else might because her brain wasn't receiving the message that this was a painful situation. And so her parents are constantly watching over her like a hawk, because if you don't have that type of mental capacity, there's 1,000 different hazards every single day in life. And so in a moment of exasperation, Ashton's mom said, "I just wish she could feel pain." What a plea from a parent, right? Like, I don't know if another parent in this room would say, "I just can't wait for my kid to get a good dose of pain today." In fact, if Ezra ever got into a little altercation on a soccer field and came up bloody, this pastor of yours would have a difficult time facing that kid's parents with the grace and peace that Jesus would require of me. So it's this kind of interesting point, but I think it brings up an interesting theological, maybe an existential question. What if there's profound purpose in the pain that we experience? I think that we try to sanitize our life and try to experience the least amount of pain as possible. But what if there's something redemptive, something vital in our journey with God that only comes through the download of experiencing and walking through pain? And if that's a fixture of human life, then these groove paths that we're tracing with God have to address pain. And what we have this morning, the second third of life, that even though the masculine journey and the female journey, the feminine journey, are going in two different directions in the second third of life, they will both deal with pain in a constructive, in a redemptive way. And so we're going to get to the bottom of that this morning. But as we talked about last week, we're going to chase the life of Jacob for the masculine journey, and we're going to trace the life of Naomi for the feminine journey of the soul. So let's start with Jacob. If you remember where we left off yesterday, he has been promised when he was in his mom's womb that even though he was the younger of twin boys, that his older brother would serve him. And so he scraped and he schemed and he tricked his brother out of the birthright. But because he did so, he had to run away from home because his brother was out to get him. And so he's journeying towards a land called Paddan Aram, where his mom's family, the extended family, lives, in order to hide from his brother and to figure out what he's going to do next. But as we trace his steps and as we follow his journey into this foreign land, we realize that this is a typical trope in a story, the hero's journey. If you remember all these superhero films that are popular in our culture, and even films like Field of Dreams, what we find in a hero's journey is that they have a ton of promise in the first part of their life, but they've got a fatal flaw that they need to deal with. And oftentimes they address that fatal flaw in an alternative universe, someplace where they go a far ways away. They deal with different challenges, and they meet strategic people for their transformation. Then they return home having been healed and transformed, and they can adequately lead their people. This seems to be what's at stake for Jacob as he journeys away. Because whatever he did in the first third of his life, the scheming, the manipulation, and the grasping for power, is done to him when he's away in this alternative universe. For instance, he's the one, his name is Jacob, which means to grab by the heel, and he deceived his brother, and he deceived his father and his family. But when he's away, he's deceived. He's the one who's the brunt of the joke. He's the one who's taken advantage of. In fact, he has his eyes set on a woman named Rachel, and Laban, his future father-in-law, says, if you work for me for 7 years, I'll give you Rachel as your spouse. And so he works for 7 years, and it only seems like a day to him. And on the night of their wedding, when it's time for the couple to be alone, just as his mother Rebekah disfigured himself to make him look like his brother Esau before Isaac, Leah, the older sister, and not Rachel, the younger sister, whom Jacob loved, is the one that's brought to him, and he's fooled once again. Her appearance has changed so that he's caught off guard. The things that were done, that he had done to others in the first third, are now being done to him. So he's away. And it seems like all of his struggle and all the things that he's going through is preparing him for something pivotal down the road. That somehow he needs to have some challenges and some frustrations in his journey so that when he perhaps faces his brother again, that there's a better outcome than what we might expect as we take in the first part of his story. This seems to be the greater plot that's happening in the book of Genesis. If you remember in Genesis chapter 4, there are a couple brothers, Cain and Abel, who are striving against one another, and Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, and he puts him to death. And so this is in the background as we engage yet another sibling rivalry. And the question that we have in the background is, what will happen between Jacob and Esau? What can God do to prevent what happened between Cain and Abel, between Jacob and Esau? And so it's in the midst of his struggle that he's deeply shaped by his experience. In the midst of his struggle, as he prepares to face his brother Esau, he leaves Paddan Aram with all of his family, with all of his belongings, and he's about ready to face off against his brother again. But in Genesis 32, he has one more struggle encounter, but this time is not with Laban, his father-in-law. This is not with his wives who are struggling with him. This is with God himself. And it's a peculiar story where Jacob's all by himself. He's sent everything ahead of him, and a man begins to wrestle with him. How they decide to wrestle, I have no idea. I mean, did they do rock, paper, scissors, and then they start to wrestle? I mean, did they give each other the stink? I have no idea. Did one have a certain color of things on and like the rival colors? The other, I have no idea. All we know is that they begin to wrestle with one another. And God is here disguised as a human person. And in Genesis 32, we have this interesting exchange between Jacob and God. This is what it says. Then the man said, let me go, for it is now daybreak. They've wrestled all night together. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, you will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel because he said this, it is because I saw the face of God, yet my life was spared. And before they part ways, this man touches his hip socket to where Jacob now walks with a limp for the rest of his life. That's an important detail before we get to the content for next week's sermon as we talk about the last third of life. But here Jacob has gone through a transformation. His name is changed. No longer shall he introduce himself as Jacob, the one who grabs by the heel, but now he's the one who wrestles with God, and people can figure out from the gait in which he's walking that hasn't gone so well. That God has put a limit to him. He's impeded his progress. He can no longer walk with his full strength, but he's been downgraded. He's been wounded, but yet he's been asked to go forward. This seems to be a pivotal part of the masculine journey as well. If we go back to our drawing, once again, the first third of life is all about climbing, and it's about experiencing power. And through trying to challenge the world and challenge others and to challenge ourselves, in the masculine journey, we have a sense of self, the things that we're good at, and the power that's at our disposal. But we can't go on living like that, it seems. It seems to be in the wisdom journey to have a moment in which all that begins to erode and fail. And so between the ages of 30 to 50, Richard Rohr says that if you're on the masculine journey, on the masculine path, that you have a crisis of limitation, where all of your power is taken from you. Or maybe you have a mismanagement of decisions and a moral failure, and it causes you to stumble. Or perhaps you're just not hip and with it any longer, and all around you they're hiring more capable people in your workplace, and you begin to have this anxiety that perhaps you don't have what it takes to continue to climb. At some point in this second third of our existence, things begin to fall apart, and they begin to erode, and we begin a different journey. One that doesn't have climbing, but descent. A descent into the wisdom journey, a descent into the unknown. This is what Richard Rohr says about this crisis of limitation. He says, sooner or later, if you're on a classical spiritual schedule, some event, person, death, idea, or relationship will enter your life that you simply cannot deal with, using your acquired knowledge or your strong willpower. Spiritually speaking, you must be led to the edge of your own private resources. And that's where God can take over. When we realize that we don't have the energy supply to go forward in our own strength. This is something that's programmed into the journey of the soul. Sometimes this is something that the decisions that we've made, some of the decisions that we've made. But this is also God using those decisions for our benefit, for the longevity of our spiritual existence. God brings us low. He allows things to erode that are important to us so that we can have our attention fastened upon him once again, and we can deal with the pain of loss. This is something that just happens in Jacob's life. It happens with other heroes of the scripture text. Take, for instance, John the Baptist. John the Baptist in the New Testament scriptures, he is the best preacher in town. People are streaming out to the Jordan River to hear his sermons and to be baptized in the Jordan River. But along the way, he gets to call out that Jesus is the Messiah. In John's gospel, he says with certainty that this is the Lamb of God who will take away the sins of the world. But towards the end of his journey, after he's been apprehended and thrown in prison because you can't speak truth to power and not escape some danger, he's rotting away in a jail cell. And in those lonely, solitary moments, he's beginning to wonder if he's lived his life correctly, if he made the right proclamation. So in Luke chapter 7, we have the story of him sending some detachments of people, some of his own disciples, to have a conversation with Jesus. And we see in Luke 7, verse 20, that the men came to him. They said, John the Baptist sent us to you to ask, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? Can you sense the pain in that question? John the Baptist donated his life to Jesus in preparing the way from him. But towards the end of his life, John the Baptist wonders if all that striving, all of that work was ultimately for nothing. And so Jesus answers by saying in some certain terms that whatever John expected, that things are going to be different, that he thought God's divine cleanup was going to happen one way, but it's actually happening another way. And there's some evidence that God is doing some unique things among us. And Jesus concludes the message back to him in verse 23, blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. John was on schedule in his soul. He had built something that was collapsing. And so Jesus tries to wrap his arm around his family member and his co-mate in the ministry. He wanted to say, don't lose heart. This is all part of the plan. Things will fall apart, but God is still with you. Perhaps this is what's happening in Jacob's life as well. As he's been striving and struggling, he's been able to build a business and to get things for himself and to get the birthright. He's getting ready to face Esau again. And without a transformation in his soul, that altercation is not going to go well. And so perhaps in the second third of his journey, as he is the brunt of jokes, as he's the one who's been taken advantage of, perhaps it's then he develops those vital feelings of empathy for his brother Esau, where he faces him perhaps and says, I know what it's like to be taken advantage of as I took advantage of you. And we'll see in the next story that all the challenge and his own crisis of limitation helps Jacob face Esau with grace and with love and with peace. This is important for us in the male journey. We go back to the drawing above, and so we have this crisis of limitation, but we have a couple of ways of warning here because there's a couple of missteps that happens when you used to be in power and everything's taken from you. Richard Rohr says that sometimes we don't heed the warning, and sometimes we don't heed the grace of what happens during our crisis of limitation, and so we try to go back to the first third of life and climb again. What happens sometimes in organizational settings that when a chairman of the board or a president of a company has their own crisis of limitation, they begin to notice that they have some anxious feelings about all these people around them, so they fire everybody and they get all new people so that no one has the dirt on them. I came across this piece of information once that after Japanese warriors come back from war, there's a rite of passage and ceremony where the people in their communities say, we value your debt of service to be our warriors, but when you come back among us, we need you to be a different person and to put your fighting ways behind and to be one who nurtures and builds. If we're not careful after a crisis of limitation, we will go back. We'll put the letter jacket back on. We'll tell our old stories of victory, and we will drive people away from us, and no one will trust us because they will sense that we are using them to climb again instead of climbing with them. Our leadership will come under question. There'll be anxiety, a general anxiety among us if we don't handle the crisis well. But the second misstep is the one that goes all the way to the right of the page, called the embittering journey. When something is taken from us because we don't like to lose, instead of embracing it as a wisdom and grace from God, sometimes we'll turn and blame others. We'll say, if my spouse didn't have this medical issue, I would have been able to put more time in the office and I would have got that promotion. If my kids didn't have so many extracurricular activities which took me away from other vital things I could have spent my time on, I could have developed this skill or that skill, and I could have found myself ahead of the game. If the market wouldn't have crashed in 2008, I'd have been in a different state, in a different scenario. And again and again and again, we will point the finger elsewhere so we don't have to grapple with the pain of loss inside. And so we drop Jacob off here, walking with him, understanding that we go through loss in this second third of life. I love how Richard Rohr says it. The truth sets you free, but it tends to make you miserable too. For a long, long time, we can justify, we can avoid the pain in our life and the truth that brings with it. But there's a time in the middle part of our life when we've got people who are counting on us, who can see things more clearly than we can about our own life, where the truth begins to come out. And it will make us miserable, but it ultimately leads to our transformation. No one likes to lose. We like to say it's rigged or that there was something out against us. But God uses the moments of loss to do something that only loss can do. And so we have to embrace the pain that comes with the crisis of limitation. So we'll drop Jacob off there, and we'll pick up with him in the next week. But let's go back to Naomi and the feminine journey. You remember from the drawing from last week, the feminine journey starts with a descent where it's hard to label or to name a feminine soul early in life because we have to wait to see how they develop and what they're into and the gifts that they have that tend to flower in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so there's an abrupt right turn that happens in the feminine soul where they begin to get more assertive. And they find a savviness and a gift set and some interest that they didn't know that they had in the first 20 years of life. And so they begin to excel. Sometimes this happens in motherhood. Sometimes it also happens in an organizational setting. I mean, have you been in a room where there's a crisis happening, but you see some mothers and grandmothers around, you're like, listen, everything's going to be okay. Or you're in a sticky situation at work and all the powerful folks are trying to scratch their heads, they're trying to figure this out because they're so removed from what actually happens in organizational life. You've got Sheila from marketing in the room and everybody's like, oh, everything's going to be fine now. Something happens in this phase, the second third of the feminine soul, where they begin to make their climb. They begin to find out who they are. They begin to have this assertiveness and a savviness that helps shape their soul for the decades ahead. And this is what's happening in Naomi's life as well. If you go back to the book of Ruth, you remember that we left her story yesterday as her and Ruth are going back to her native Bethlehem. They've gone away, and Naomi's carrying an outsider with her, and there's a sticky situation there because in this community, it's hard to bring outsiders into the inside. In fact, the irony of the book of Ruth and where it lands in the Old Testament is that if you go back to the book of Judges, which is just one book behind it, towards the end of the book of Judges, there's a woman from Bethlehem that causes a lot of baby mama drama in their midst. And so as you finish the book of Judges, you think of all this destruction and the disorder because of someone from Bethlehem. You think, man, Bethlehem has to have, really to keep a tight rein on all their women. And you got this amazing story of Ruth, how Naomi brings home an outsider, a Moabite, and through careful and delicate sidesteps and decisions, helps to integrate this outsider into the life of the community. She has a savviness. She's got an expertise and an assertiveness. She could have journeyed into Bethlehem and just said, well, let's just kind of get the lay of the land for a few days and to see what happens. But we don't see that in this story. What we see in this story is Naomi jumping at the opportunity to take advantage of the moment. And it was difficult to imagine a Moabite person being a vital person in the community. But Ruth got there because of Naomi's intellect, because of her brilliance, and because of the grace that God gave her. We see in chapter 2 of Ruth, Ruth has been out. She's been gleaning in the fields because it's the harvest season. And there's a man named Boaz who's allowed her, even as an outsider, to be among those who are gleaning on the edges of the field. And he gave her some extra food. And so as Ruth comes back to Naomi that night to tell her all that's happened, Naomi knows what's going on, and she knows the opportunity, the window of opportunity she has. We see in verse 20 of chapter 2 where Naomi bursts with affirmation. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and to the dead. And she added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. And through the rest of the story, Naomi's able, because of her insider information, to give vital cues to Ruth to integrate her into the life of the community. Things to do with sandals and uncovering people's feet on the threshing floor at certain times of the season. All these things that only an insider can know. And it's because Naomi trusts what God has placed within her for such a time as this. And that's what's at stake in the second, third, and the feminine journey. Where in the feminine soul, you begin to trust yourself and to trust what God has given you. Begin to make your climb, begin to find your place, begin to find your gifts and excel in them as God gives you opportunity. But you'll notice something towards the end of the straight line in the work of the body and soul in this second third of life. There's a box that we call the pooling of pain. Because typically for the feminine soul, they've had a couple of decades of wins and successes. They've killed it in the office. They've raised a family. They've got all this great momentum, this great wind in their sails. But towards the end of the 40s and into the 50s, and I see this again and again in pastoral situations, there's a pooling up of pain. Because when you've had some wins, when you've had some success, you begin to forecast how things are going to go. But I've had many moms on my couch who are wondering why they're not grandparents yet. Wondering why their children have turned out the way that they have. Wondering if they've made the wrong decisions in the past. Wondering why there's still this gap between them and their spouse, even though they've had all this diligent work. Why, after all those secret moments and those secret deeds of trying to kill at the office and to go the extra mile, to give the extra effort in their workplaces, they're still not as far ahead as other people in the organization. And so the question that happens in the pooling of pain is, what is it all worth after all this effort? And there's a decision that the feminine soul has to make. Perhaps God can still use it for the rest of my story, all that I've experienced, or they take their own right turn towards the embittering journey, where they begin to point the blame, to make up the justifications in order to hide their pain. But if their pain can come under the grace of Christ, their soul is shaped, and they're prepared for the third part of their journey that we'll see next week as we trace the final steps of the life of Naomi. But what we have to grapple with in the second, third for the feminine soul is, can we deal with not having our way even though we've given so much after all that waiting before? Is there still juice in this story to bring it to its redemptive end? And God's grace edges us towards optimism in that moment instead of pessimism and blame and bitterness in that moment. So here's a couple things. If you're living in the second third of your existence, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, or if you got someone that you love that's in that bucket of ages, it's a couple things. I could say 8 different things here. But the first thing I'll say is this: if you're connected, let's say you're in a marriage or if you're in like a tight group of friends, expect that you're going to learn to live out of sync with the people that you're closely connected to. I think there's It's a level of expectancy in a marriage that you and your spouse are going to grow the same way at the same time. You're going to be seeing eye to eye on all things. But it's simply not the case. I find in the second, third of life that somebody's going for a promotion while the other one's going back to school and starting their career all the way over. Or one gets to stay at home with the kids and the other one's going to the office, or one gets to go to school while the other one has to take a second job in order to cover the bills for all that. And so there's this antagonism that happens sometimes in the second, third of life. When is it going to be my turn to be the center of this family? We need to expect, even in the spiritual life, to live out of sync. I remember a devastating moment in ministry. At one church I was at, there was a women's ministry that was growing, and women in our church were growing by leaps and bounds. But instead of that being a joyous moment, a lovely moment, they were tempted to belittle their spouses because their spouses didn't seem to have the same interest in spiritual things as they did. So instead of being an inspiration to their spouse, a wedge was driven between them, and blaming and bitterness was there. And many marriages fell apart because of it. And how unfortunate it was that a small group that was meant to nourish one's faith ultimately caused an unraveling of several people's faith. We have to be flexible in this time of life. So if you're connected, have grace for yourself and grace for the ones you're connected to. You're not all going to grow at the same time in the same leaps, in the same bounds. And the last one is to learn to dwell in deep community. I've noticed in the second, third of life, because I'm enjoying it right now, is it's harder to make and sustain friends. I remember in high school and in college, you could make friends just because you both like pepperoni pizza. I mean, can you know what I mean? It was so easy, and it was light, and it was fun, and you have all these different acquaintances, all these different friends. But something happened, like when we had to start adulting and things got real serious. It's like now you look around and you're like, wow, where did all the friendships go? I think sometimes because of that, our overreaction is to keep things light so that we don't run anyone off with our hot takes about politics or college football, and so we just keep everything light. Sometimes the second, third of life turns into a cocktail party instead of a community. This light conversation just to get through the moment, to where we drive away saying, yeah, I really like those people. But then we don't see them for a couple months, and we say, hey, we have to catch up sometime. Here's what I noticed about the line, let's catch up sometime. That person is not your friend if you're saying that to them. So what we need in the second, third of life with all of its complexities as we're dealing with pain is deep community. You know, in the second, third of life, you could be raising teenagers and taking care of aging parents at the same time. You could be moving to a different city or going back to school and taking a huge leap of faith in your career. What's important and vital in this moment in time is to have a group of people that you can count on, who know you, who you can ask the tough questions to, and they can look you in the eye and they could tell you that you're not being completely honest with them. And you could deal with the pain that's been festering inside. I've been watching college football like maybe some of you, and there's a new show that's getting ready to launch on ABC called A Million Little Things. And they've been showing a trailer about a group of friends who bonded together because they're all trapped in an elevator together. So in that crisis, they decided, we're going to be best friends. This is just the universe telling us that we're all going to be friends. And it seems like from the trailer, they've given a lot about the plot already, that this group of friends, they started off connecting, and they would go to Boston Bruins hockey games together. They had all these rhythms of friendship, but they began to back away from one another until one person in their group decides to take his life. And the moment of that pain and tragedy has drawn them back together. And you'll see it in the trailer if you ever go to YouTube and watch it, is that some honest questions about their lack of friendship begin to come to the surface. And towards the end of the trailer, the person who takes his life, this last line is said in his voice, true friendship is being able to have the hard conversations and being willing to listen to a million different things, little things. And that's going to be my prayer for us, those of us in the second, third of our experience. That we don't have just a cocktail party in the spiritual life, but we have a deep, abiding community that travels together. Because in the midst of Jesus' pain, he drew a community together. He says in John's gospel that when he's lifted up from the earth, he's going to draw all people to himself. In the midst of his pain, without avoiding it, Jesus draws people together. And maybe that's the example of the Christian community. That pain shouldn't put us in isolation, but it should ultimately draw us together. And it's my deep prayer as the senior pastor of Advent that even our pain can draw us together. in the midst of this church community.